Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Anne Olnick Gumowitz, the Engelson Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Joan Gans Cooney and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Sally Menard and Norton Garfinkel, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.
I'm Alexander Hefner, your host on The Open Mind. The courageous literary lion who joins us today has created dangerously, forever epitomizing the pursuit of free expression. Prize-winning novelist, President Emeritus of the PEN American Center, Salman Rushdie famously authored The Satanic Verses in 1988. Its publication precipitated death threats from hateful theocrats, and terrorism raged. Now Rushdie's first adult novel in nearly 8 years reimagines the classic Arabian lore, 1001 Nights. The title, 2 years, 8 months, and 28 nights. It's another tour de force of magical realism. And in his new age of mythology, strange creatures, the jinn, rule over New York City with brute force in the aftermath of a great storm. In this off-satirical fantasy, philosophical questions concerning faith and truth are disputed. The dark jinn, fractious, inattentive, vain, and cruel as they were, feared but also hated, Rushdie writes, found in a short time that their vision of colonizing the earth and enslaving its peoples wasn't enough to survive. So I want to ask Rushdie, what are we to gather from these eerily familiar, barbarous creatures? And it's truly an honor to be with you today.
Thank you. It's great to be with you too. Thank you for that really enjoyable summary of this crazy book. I think the thing I've always thought about the literature of the fantastic, the kind of surrealist, non-naturalistic literature, is that it's only interesting if it's in some way about the real world. That if it's just escapist fantasy, that's of no interest to me. That's if you like children's literature. But if grown-ups are going to use this kind of way of speaking, it really has to be just another way of talking about what's going on. I think the great thing about literature is that it needs not to be too literal. If it's just preaching at you about what you can find on the news anyway, then it's not interesting either. So you have to find just another way of talking, and I think for me, this wonderful storehouse of stories which I grew up with, which are the so-called wonder tales of the East, of which the Arabian Nights is the most famous, but by no means the only compendium. They just have always given me a kind of clue about how one can talk, in a way that's not just journalistic. And I think, one of the strange things about this phrase, magic realism, that gets thrown at me quite often.
Forgive me.
No, it's all right. But it's that when people use it, they kind of only hear the magic. They don't hear the realism. And I think what's interesting about this kind of writing is that it's both things. That it is actually very often really grounded in an idea of reality and the truth and so on. But then uses these other methods to approach it.
Fantastically.
Yeah. I've always been, magic realism is just the latest label, and I think if you look back a little bit to things, surrealism, it's the same thing. In the 70s in American literature, there was this movement which got called fabulism, which was people like Thomas Pynchon and John Barth and Robert Coover and so on. Same thing. So this idea of using fairy tale, folk tale, surreal events as a way of telling stories about the real world. It's always been there. It's always been there. I mean, you could look at Russian literature, and it's there in Gogol and Bulgakov. You could look anywhere in the world, you find it cropping up every so often. So I'm just the latest outcrop.
So as you conceived of the djinn, what was the realistic analog here?
Well, what I thought was this, that we live in this world in which I think many of us feel that we don't really understand what's going on, and that somehow the rules of the game appear not to operate anymore. That we live in a world we don't understand, in which the kind of familiar shapes of the world and in a way the way things are supposed to be, it no longer apply. And something new and rather horrible appears to be going on, which is very hard to grasp, just mentally hard to grapple with. And I think that's a sense that many people have, of how they feel in the world today. So I wanted to dramatize that. As I say, not literally, not to say let's make an allegory about ISIS or whatever. I mean, that's not really what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to say that there is this breakdown in the familiar, and the world has become an unfamiliar and quite dark place. And how do we live in it? How do we deal with that? How do we confront that?
You've experienced that darkness intimately. Mm-hmm. And so I wondered, as you reflect on contemporary society and the efforts towards breeding a climate of truce and calm and compassion, as opposed to Satan, evil. Yeah. Do you see it as a viable path?
I hope so. I'm the peace-loving guy. I also think, if you look at recent history, the path of war has been notably unsuccessful. Wherever you look, whether you look in the Middle East or in Afghanistan or wherever you look, dropping bombs and shooting guns and sending tanks out there and so on has really, what has that done? Except make the world in many ways more dangerous than it was. So I'm not impressed by the hawkish arguments, because they're so disproved by recent events, just as whether they're effective or not. On the other hand, I really don't know what I think about these attempts to make peace in the Middle East, especially with Iran. Because Iran's a treacherous place, and they're quite capable of saying one thing and doing another. So I think the whole test of this deal is going to be how much scrutiny is allowed of the Iran nuclear project, and if there's any attempt to backslide from that openness and transparency, then it's a bad deal.
And as the Ayatollah will overrule the foreign minister.
Yeah, although at the moment he seems to be not doing that. He seems to be telling the Iranian press to praise this as a mighty victory. And I find that language of victory and defeat kind of tedious and boring and anti-intelligent. But so I don't know. My view is not proven. I think the alternative is dreadful, but that doesn't necessarily mean this is a good thing.
As you and your friend Bill Maher and many self-identified secularists, atheists have found a new hero, and it's in the Catholic Church, Pope Francis.
Oh, don't put me.
But hear me out, because I'm very curious about your insight into this. It's a question that's percolated for me. The Pope has been very active in the negotiations and was heralded as the decisive actor in Cuba, normalizing relations between the United States and Cuba. Why do you think that he's been silent on the Iranian nuclear deal? There's
I don't know, Mickey, he doesn't have to have a view about everything. It's not required for him to be an extra politician in a frock.
Right.
But I think he's an interesting figure, and I think he's, as one might expect, in some ways problematic and in some ways surprisingly progressive. And so I think when he talks about environmental issues, for example, it's kind of rather wonderful to hear those words coming out of such a powerful place. But on the other hand, in the case of the vote in Ireland in favour of gay rights and so on, I mean, the Vatican was very hostile to that. So sometimes he's progressive and sometimes not so much. And I don't know. My view is it's a shame we have to look there for our
inspiration.
Because that's not where I look.
Right. Where did you look? Now, obviously, you have an inspiring story, but one that was challenging personally to live through in an ordeal, and the threats of violence. So, as that initial spark of terrorism, and I really wonder if you think that moment in history was an illustration of kind of portended a several decades of this cruelty and mischief towards humanists and people who want to freely express their ideas.
Yeah. No, I mean, I actually, when I wrote my memoir, Joseph Anton, I sort of more or less said that. I mean, I think that I don't know that it was the first thing, but it was one of the early, let's say, notes of the music, which we now hear everywhere all the time, But one of the things I felt about writing that memoir, which was the book immediately before this, is that it felt like I just got that monkey off my back, and I'm frankly sick of my own story, because I didn't get into writing books in order to talk about myself. I wanted to make up stories about other people. And the thing that really excites me as a writer is when people that I've made up come to life on the page. I mean, that's the great pleasure. And in this book there are, I mean, some of the zaniest characters, that I've ever come up with. But zany isn't enough. In the end, they've got to be human beings on the page. And when they begin to feel to me like they have a kind of life of their own, that's what excites me as a writer. And one of the things I've learned, because in a way of what happened to me, and people's desire to see me in my books all the time, which character is him, is that I've learned not to have autobiographical characters in my books, not to have characters where people can say, oh, that's the author in disguise. Just as a way of doing what I want to do, which is to tell stories about the world. There's a theme in the book which is about a kind of collision between a rational, let's say a reason-driven view of the world and a faith-driven view of the world. And I think many of us can see that straightforwardly applies to the world outside the studio.
Expound on that in the narrative that you construct for our viewers.
Yeah. Well, one of the characters in the book is based on sort of my version of this 12th century Spanish Moorish philosopher known in the West as Averroes and in the Muslim world as Ibn Rushd, which is also where my family name comes from. And he, in his time, he was a great scholar of Aristotle. And his vision was to try and find a way of uniting logic, reason, science, uniting that with religion. He was not irreligious. He always considered himself to be a religious man. But he wanted to find a way of uniting these different strands of his own thinking. Right? And against that, there is there's what we've now come to understand as literalism, which rejects the intervention of reason and science into theology, into religious questions, and just simply says God is capable of anything. I mean, there's a little episode there which is actually taken genuinely from this dispute in real philosophy, where the philosopher, the literalist, if you like, philosopher Ghazali, uses the image of a flame and a ball of cotton. And he says, what do you think happens if you touch a ball of cotton with a flame? And the obvious answer is that the ball of cotton catches fire. But why is that? See, now the man of reason would say, well, it's because it's the natural law that fire burns cotton. And Averroes would have said that once God has put those laws in place, they simply apply. But the counter-argument is, no, God is not bound by natural laws. If God decided that the cotton would extinguish the flame, he could make that happen. And the flame only burns the cotton because at that moment God decides that's okay to do. So those two views of the world, if you like, the magical and the reasonable view of the world, and I'm very often on the magical side. So it's not like a black-white, good-bad thing. But in fact, what the book, I think, one of the things that it tries to suggest is that when these things do blend, when they come together, something rather wonderful happens. And that neither of them is entirely able to function without the other. It's like what I was saying about magic realism. The magic and the realism, put them together, something interesting.
And are the jinn the vehicle through which humanity ultimately reconciles these?
Well, the jinn, are these supernatural beings,
right,
who live in a separate world to ours. Which is known in the East as Paristan, which literally translates as fairyland. So that's where they live. And the idea of the novel is that because of a series of natural phenomena on Earth, like giant storms and so on, the seals between the worlds are broken. And so these very powerful and rather malicious supernatural beings are able to show up here in New York City and make trouble. And for me, that was just a way of saying, let's talk about the eruption into the world of the irrational, and not just the irrational, but the mischievous. It doesn't have to be evil. Sometimes it's just mischief, playfulness, a refusal to obey the normal rules of things. Doing things to people that they can't believe. Like there's one of the main characters of the novel is this gardener who suddenly discovers that he's come detached from the ground. Somebody whose life is his love of the earth, is suddenly floating above the ground. And I thought the thing that makes it funny to me is that he's not just floating up in the sky. He's like this much above the ground. He's like half an inch above the ground, and which is just as scientifically impossible as being 20 feet up. So. But that kind of idea that the jinn arrive and mess with our heads and make ordinary life suddenly unpredictable. I mean, there's a jinn in the novel who transforms himself into a giant sea monster and eats the Staten Island ferry. That's not supposed to happen.
Well, it's in that merger of the fantasy and the reality, because when we see the images in closer proximity than ever of Pluto, and as the work is underway to see what extraterrestrial life may or may not be out there.
I'm totally in favor of extraterrestrial life, and I think first of all it's just about inevitable that it's going to be there. I loved it that Pluto had a heart on its surface, very cold heart. It's cold out there, but I think just the idea that we're alone in the universe is just untenable. I think there's just too much out there. And we're only just beginning to find, Earth-type planets.
You identify the inherent resilience of humanity in this passage here, which I thought was quite moving after reading the story. We can assert with some degree of confidence that the recovery was swift after the jinn's takeover, indicating both the resilience of human society and the shallowness of the control of the jinn over their conquests.
Well, I just thought, it would be so easy, given what we see in the newspapers every day, to write a book in which everything's horrible, and then it gets worse, and it ends terribly. Right now that's easy, and therefore not interesting. I thought history isn't like that. History is full of surprises, enormous changes very suddenly. If I had told you, even 6 months before the fall of the Berlin Wall, that communism was about to disappear, you would have thought I was an idiot, because it seemed so solid, and yet it just blew away like dust. People trying to bring it back now, but that's another story. So I think to see history as something which is just inevitable, especially in a dark time, which I believe this is, to think it can only get worse and worse and worse, that's a mistake too. And so I wanted to suggest that things change. Good moments end, bad moments end, and how I do believe that the human race is very resilient, and has a very, very powerful survival instinct, and in the same way as the communist ideology was blown away, the next ideology will blow away as well. And then, there might be something else horrible after that, but I'm not saying that there'll be some simple happy ending.
Right. Speaking of which, you and fellow activists, luminaries, many artists and authors wrote a manifesto in response to both the episode of the Mohammed cartoon and then again after the incident at the French magazine.
Yeah.
And together facing the new totalitarianism, which you signed along with Ayaan Hirsi Ali and a host of others. And together you wrote, like all totalitarianisms, Islamism is nurtured by fears and frustrations. This is collectively, not you specifically. The hate preachers bet on these feelings in order to form battalions destined to impose an unegalitarian world. So charting the egalitarian path forward to you embodies, if not atheism, a kind of secularism to which you subscribe.
Well, it embodies a need to be deeply skeptical about the assertions of religious belief, and particularly when that religious belief is allied to machine guns, and I think it's very important. It's a very important fundamental part of an open society that we retain a skepticism about everything. That we don't take politicians for granted. We don't take ideas for granted. We constantly question and argue. And it's not even that we come to a conclusion, but the ability to question and argue is a kind of definition of freedom.
And that has been ceaselessly under fire in the part of the world
very much
that
so.
issued the fatwa.
And remember that the people who are most impacted by Islamic radicalism are Muslims. That's 95% of the deaths of Muslims around the world are inflicted by radical Muslims. Not by Western drones, if you like. But so the attack is first and foremost on the Muslim community itself, trying to bring it into a kind of position of submission. And that's why it becomes frustrating when people argue that to criticize this kind of fanatical totalitarian Islam is somehow to be, hostile towards the Muslim community. It's actually the opposite of that. It's trying to say, these are the people who are most in danger from this. We are kind of side effects. And so I think it's extremely important to be able to, to draw cartoons, to make jokes, to mock. Mocking religion is something which is extremely important to do. In fact, the whole of our idea of free expression, the one which makes it possible for you and me to have this conversation, came out of the French Enlightenment originally. Brought here by Tom Paine and others, and the French Enlightenment deliberately set itself to break the power of the church, to limit what could be said. And writers like Voltaire and Diderot and so on, that they understood that the danger to free expression did not so much come from the state, it came from the church. And the Catholic Church at that time, with its anathemas and inquisitions and excommunications and all these tools that it had to bring people into line, And it's the ability, the success of those thinkers in establishing freedom to speak in spite of the objections of the church is really what created our current idea of free speech. So now we find ourselves, in a way, repeating the argument, different church, same argument.
What will make obsolete theocracy?
Well, the truth is, I'm a child of the 60s, and I was 21 in 1968. It's a good year to be 21 for various reasons. But at that time, the idea that religion would re-emerge to have such a powerful place at the center of public affairs would have seemed absurd. It would have seemed absurd. Religion, nobody was talking about it. It was a busted flush. So it's one of the great surprises of my life that something which I had, like many people of my generation, had discounted as a force should have reemerged so strongly as a force. So I back to the 60s, sex and drugs and rock and roll. That'll do it.
Salman Rushdie, I want to thank you for being on this show. We really probe the minds, and yours is one that is both creatively superior and infectious. And thank you for sharing your work with the world.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other Open Mind interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Anne Olnick Gumowitz, the Engelson Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Joan Gans Cooney and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Sally Menard and Norton Garfinkel, with special thanks to the Schumann Media Center for additional support, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.